to Vanquish. I talk about cars and, unfortunately for everyone involved, I never shut up about them. Today, we're talking about the Porsche 992.2 Carrera GTS, a car that completely ruined normal cars for me. So let's begin then. A few months ago, my parents surprised me with something I'd wanted for years. A Porsche Experience. 1 hour in a Porsche. At first, I had absolutely no idea what was happening. We pulled into the dealership. I was surrounded by cars I'd only ever admired through a screen. And then an employee walked over with a smile, greeted us, and casually said, "You'll be going out in the new Carrera GTS today." I'm fairly certain my brain stopped working. I'd never sat in a Porsche before. I'd certainly never imagined my first experience would be in one of the newest GTS models. The moment I climbed inside and that flat six barked into life behind me, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary drive. Now, obviously, the instructor knew exactly what he was doing. Handing the keys to an overexcited teenager who's obsessed with Porsches would probably be terrible for business. But even from the passenger seat, one thing became obvious almost immediately. This thing doesn't feel intimidating. Despite producing over 500 horsepower, it never feels like it's plotting your demise. It doesn't bounce around, it doesn't fight you, and it certainly doesn't feel nervous. Instead, it feels composed. This quiet confidence, like it knows exactly what it's capable of. That's the magic of a 911. It looks elegant enough to drive to work every day, park outside a restaurant and be appreciated while you drink your cappuccino, or take on a road trip across Europe. But press the throttle, and suddenly it remembers it shares DNA with cars that have embarrassed Ferraris for decades, and still do. Now this particular generation, the 992.2, introduced something that caused quite a stir. The T-Hybrid. And before anyone hears the word hybrid and starts typing an angry comment, relax. Porsche hasn't turned the 911 into a Prius. In fact, they've used electrification for one reason and one reason only: to make the car even better to drive. Turbocharged engines have always suffered from one annoying little compromise: turbo lag. You press the accelerator, the engine thinks about it, has a quick meeting, checks its calendar, and eventually decides to make boost. Porsche looked at that and simply said, "No, we're not having that." So they fitted an electric motor directly onto the turbocharger itself. The moment you press the throttle, that electric motor spins the turbo instantly. Boost arrives almost immediately. Full response becomes razor sharp, and instead of behaving like a traditional turbocharged engine, it responds much more like a naturally aspirated GT3. But Porsche didn't stop there. Hidden inside the new 8-speed PDK gearbox is another electric motor. This one produces up to 54 horsepower, delivers 150 Newton meters of torque from virtually idle, and even replaces the conventional starter motor and alternator. Now, unlike something like a Toyota Prius, this motor never drives the car on electricity alone, because that's not the point. The point isn't fuel economy. It never was, to be honest. It's performance, or as every petrolhead knows, smiles per mile. The cleverness doesn't stop there either. Every time you brake, coast downhill, or simply lift off the throttle, the motor switches roles and becomes a generator, recovering energy and quietly recharging the battery. There's no plug, no charging cable, you don't even have to think about it. The car does all the work while you simply enjoy driving it. Now let's talk about the battery. Whenever people hear the word hybrid, they immediately imagine a massive battery pack weighing half as much as the car itself. Not here. The battery runs on 400 volts, stores just 1.9 kilowatt hours of energy, weighs only 27 kilograms, and is roughly the size of a conventional starter battery. In fact, The entire T hybrid system adds only about 50 kilograms compared to the previous Carrera GTS. Considering everything it does, that's extraordinary. The battery isn't there to give you electric range. It isn't there so you can silently cruise through a city center. It's only there for one reason: performance, which tells you everything you need to know about Porsche's priorities. The results speak for themselves. Compared with the previous 992.1 Carrera GTS, power rises from 480 horsepower to 541 horsepower. Torque climbs from 570 to 610 Newton meters. The sprint from 0 to 100 kilometers per hour drops from approximately 3.4 seconds to just 3 seconds with launch control. And yes, that is a gain of 61 horsepower. But some people will look at that figure and immediately say, but the 918 Spider is still faster. Well, of course it is. The 918 is a hypercar. Comparing the two is like asking why a peregrine falcon flies faster than a golden retriever. They're designed for completely different jobs. What Porsche has achieved here is arguably even more impressive. For over 60 years, they've stubbornly insisted on putting the engine in completely the wrong space. Every engineering textbook says it's a terrible idea. Porsche's response? Watch this. Generation after generation, they've refined the same basic recipe of throwing it away. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Except Porsche don't just leave it alone. They perfect it. The T-Hybrid isn't there because Porsche wanted to follow a trend. It's there because it solves a problem. It fills in the gaps. It eliminates turbo lag. It sharpens the throttle. And somehow, it makes the 911 feel even more like a 911. That's the genius of Porsche. Anyone can build a fast car. Plenty of manufacturers already do. But very few can take an icon, improve it year after year, and still have it instantly recognizable from 100 meters away. That's engineering. That's confidence. And perhaps that's why, after more than 60 years, the Porsche 911 remains the benchmark everyone else quietly measures themselves against. So, are there any downsides? Well, yes. As brilliant as the 992.2 Carrera GTS is, it isn't perfect. Nothing is. The first, and probably the biggest, is the price. Before you've even left the dealership, Porsche's configurator has already convinced you that you absolutely need carbon fiber mirror caps, a leather steering column, and stitching in crayon that'll somehow cost more than my first car. And before you know it, you've spent enough money to buy a house in some part of the world. Then there's the hybrid system. For some enthusiasts, more like the purists, the word hybrid is enough to trigger an existential crisis. To them, a 911 should be simple. Petrol, flat six, turbochargers. End of story. And I understand that, of course. More technology means more complexity. There are now electric motors, high voltage components, and extra electronics. That's inevitably going to make some people wonder what ownership will look like in 10 or 15 years down the line. And honestly, that's a completely fair concern. Another criticism is the sound. Thanks to increasingly strict emissions regulations, modern performance cars simply don't sound as wild as they used to. I mean, of course, you can still slap on some JCR Development's exhaust pipes on it and make it sound even better, but its stock is always better usually. So, does the 992.2 still sound fantastic? Absolutely. But if you grew up worshipping naturally aspirated, Mezger-powered 911s screaming towards 9,000 RPM, you'll probably still miss them. But here's the thing. Every single generation of the 911 has been criticized. When Porsche replaced air-cooled engines with water cooling, people said it wasn't a proper 911. When turbos became the norm, people complained. When hydraulic steering disappeared, people were mad. When PDK started replacing manual gearboxes, people whined. And now, the hybrid system, people are complaining again. It's almost tradition at this point. Yet somehow, generation after generation, the 911 keeps getting better. Not because Porsche chases trends, but because they obsess over the tiny details. Milliseconds, grams, throttle response, weight distribution, things most people will never notice until they drive one. When I walked into the Porsche Center that day, I thought I was just going to look at all the different cars and models inside of the dealership since I was begging my mom for months to go there and have a look. But I wasn't expecting it to completely change the way I looked at cars. Before that day, horsepower was just a number. Torque was something I read on spec sheets. Hybrid technology sounded, well, a little boring, honestly. But after spending an hour in the passenger seat of a 992.2 Carrera GTS, I finally understood something. Great cars aren't defined by numbers. They're defined by how they make you feel, the confidence they inspire, the memories they create, the smile they leave on your face long after you've stepped out. And perhaps that's why, more than 60 years after the first 911 rolled out of Stuttgart, it's still the benchmark. It's still the car everyone secretly wants to beat. And somehow, it still manages to surprise us. So yes, you could call this video quote-unquote glaze, and you'd probably be right. But after experiencing the 992 Carrera GTS, I think Porsche have definitely earned it.